Hello. Just testing the audio because that's about like half of my existence on this channel is simply testing audio. My mic there? We can move my mic there and not have absurd amounts of issues. Things sound pretty good. I might turn the music down just a tish. Like just the tish. Just the slightest bit. I don't really have anything to be on the screen for this video, which is fine. It's chill. It's mostly gonna be like me talking from script. And then maybe I shouldn't turn it down. I don't know what to do. Yeah, I don't really have anything to have on screen. We're gonna be talking from my script. I'm gonna be doing lots of readings. This is a far more research video than like my typical streams, because my typical streams are just like the book streams. But we're gonna work with the things that we got. Yeah, it's gonna be more researched than my book streams are, because my book streams are basically me just talking shop, chit-chatting, while I like do typically read quotes and stuff from my notes. But this is like a lot more information I'd like to try and get accurate if we're talking about it. Okay, but today I want to talk about the Kids Online Safety Act going around the United States Congress. The KOSA, Kids Online Safety Act, is a bill that is going to implement liability for websites, online platforms to like hold them liable for the things that kids access online on their sites. The purpose, the reasoning for the bill is that KOSA creates a duty of care for social media platforms to limit addictive or harmful features that have demonstrably affected the mental health of children. The bill also requires platforms to develop more robust parental controls. That's from TechCrunch. The main concerns, and a lot of the stuff I'm going to be reading here comes from the Electronic Frontier Foundation, but the major concern with the bill is that KOSA is likely to exacerbate the risks of children being harmed online because it places barriers on the ability to access lawful speech about addiction, eating disorders, bullying, and other important topics. So Jason Kelly, who is a representative at EFF, says it would still let federal and state officials decide what information can be shared online and how everyone can access lawful speech. It would still require an enormous number of websites, apps, and online platforms to filter and block legal and important speech. It would almost certainly still result in age verification requirements. So to start, let's talk about the duty of care, which is a lot of the core of KOSA. So KOSA's core component requires an online platform or service that is likely to be accessed by young people to, quote, exercise reasonable care in the creation and implementation of any design feature to prevent and mitigate various harms to minors. These enumerated harms include mental health disorders, anxiety, depression, eating disorders, substance use disorders, and suicidal behaviors, patterns of use that indicate or encourage addiction-like behaviors, physical violence, online bullying, and harassment. The consequences that KOSA creates are KOSA makes online services that host our digital speech liable should they fail to exercise reasonable care in removing or restricting minors' access to lawful content on the topics KOSA identifies. KOSA is worse than the ordinance in Smith, which is a precedent case that went to the Supreme Court. We'll be talking about that more later. It is worse than the ordinance in Smith because the First Amendment generally protects speech about addiction, suicide, eating disorders, and the other topics KOSA singles out. And I do want to acknowledge that when talking about the term reasonable care, I feel like for a lot of a general audience, it feels like a open shut thing. Don't you care about kids? but there's a lot of the issue of, is this the thing that's actually going to help kids? And for sites like Facebook, Twitter, warriorcats.com, which was a forum I frequented as a child, and other sites that are hit by this act, with this act, will run into the issue that is extremely difficult to actually enforce this restriction while keeping it focused on what we were being told is objectively bad speech, and that alone is so complex and frankly subjective that is impossible to accomplish attacking only explicitly harmful speech in general, let alone at such a mass scale as the full entire internet, basically. But primarily sites like Twitter and Facebook that encounter such large amounts of interaction every second. EFF goes on to touch on this in an example of a complicated situation that this act, the KOSA, will cause a lot of problems for. The example they're talking about is a drug addiction forum. A revision to the act tries to address concerns people have over censoring legal speech on the topics at hand, over the mental health, the addiction, all of those topics, but they added a rule of construction to KOSA which details, in response to censorship concerns about the duty of care, KOSA's authors added a rule of construction stating that nothing in the duty of care, quote, shall be construed to require a covered platform to prevent or preclude minors from deliberately or independently searching for content of the platforms or services from providing resources that prevent or mitigate the harms KOSA identifies, including evidence-based information and clinical resources. I'd like to touch on EFF's main point with regards to the addition is that how is a site to prove that a minor encountered this information via a search? How is one supposed to prove that that is the means that the minor found it, especially if the minor searched for the site and then encountered, quote, the harms later on? How is one supposed to prove these things, especially when it comes to smaller sites? But I want to essentially rant. I want to scream and shout and cry about the second half here, because as someone who is in the mental health space, this entire thing is so fucking exhausting. Let's talk about, because they mention, EFF mentions on their site that drug addiction doesn't, like, if there's just no consensus on a lot of matters with regards to drug addiction, and that applies to so many things, especially across the medical field. And so to insist on evidence-based, medically backed information doesn't, it insists on a thing that isn't there. It insists on a solid answer, on a consensus, on a universally agreed upon solution that isn't there. For example, one thing, there's also the fact that drug addiction in the specific example they've given often requires you to wean off of a drug rather than quitting cold turkey, and that kind of information would likely end up getting flagged. Something saying that you still need access to whatever drug you're addicted to would likely get flagged. Things like acknowledging suicide as a choice likely would get flagged. Acknowledging the active COVID pandemic along with other like massive viruses, health issues, measles, bird flu and shit going around. The government is dismissing these things, even though they've brought evidence as to why these things are terribly, terribly dangerous and should be taken more seriously. They just act counter to the evidence they've brought forth and call anyone acting with regards and acting according to those, like, to that information, they record it as fear mongering or overly anxious. That sounds like it could very easily be along the lines that we get flagged, especially in some states where they are banning masks and stuff like that. Even like Florida, where the measles. I'm so upset. And then you have to acknowledge the fact that every step of the system, from the medical system to the legal system that would be persecuting a site for this information, every single step of this system is biased, and often the people that are struggling, the people that are marginalized, have to fight against these systems to have their struggles acknowledged. And so it disgusts me, it icks me out that they're trying to make it inaccessible for young people to receive information that is not brought forth by the same system that is often causing them harm. For example, let's have some more example. There was a media outrage several years ago, just everywhere on fucking news sites. Oh my god, all these kids are mimicking Tourette's. All these kids are being goofy because social media with Tourette's. But in reality, they were actually just girls that did have Tourette's. And they were picking up each other's tics because that just happens with Tourette's. That's a known thing to happen with Tourette's. But because it was kids and because they were finding community, they were finding each other on social media, everyone dismissed it, and no one wanted to spread the correct information about what was going on, because that doesn't fit the idea of, oh my god, kids are goofy, kids are ridiculous, you can't take kids seriously, kids are always a problem. There's that. It would also be used to stop, again, biased individuals, including medical professionals, that will use ideas rooted in fat phobia to push eating disorders on fat people. That it would never be used to stop that kind of thing that pushes eating disorders, but it would more likely target the fat liberation movements and movements that say that being fat is okay, being fat is a body type, stuff like that, because the medical field, despite having the evidence that being fat is a body type, would push, because the fat phobic bias in the medical field would target the fat liberation movement as perpetuating and pushing unhealthy lifestyles, despite the actual evidence that's there. Because again, you have, if it's a biased medical system that's proposing it, and if it's a biased legal system that is deciding what the solution, deciding what is okay and what is not, then the free speech is no longer there. The free speech is no longer there. And another thing to consider with regards to when we're talking about things that are impacting the mental health of kids, there was the death of a trans teen named Next Benedict, who died, and despite the medical examiner finding multiple contusions, lacerations, and abrasions on their head and neck, according to NBC, that was a quote from NBC, from this child getting jumped, the police insisted that the attack was insignificant and ruled their death a suicide. We know that this would be used as an example as to why access to information about gender identity would be something that you should hide from kids, but it would never be used as a way, as evidence to limit access to white supremacist and other bigoted forms of speech that we know lead to acts of violence. I'm so frustrated. So frustrated. I need a drink, and then we'll get back to the script. It's exhausting thinking about what actually practically would get withheld from kids with this bill. Okay, back to the consequences and enforcement. Quote, KOSA creates liability for any regulated platform or service that sends certain content to minors that the bill deems harmful to them. To comply with this new liability, those platforms and services options are limited. As we see them, the options are either to filter content for known minors or to gate content so only adults can access it. In either scenario, the linchpin is the platform knowing every user's age, so it can identify its minor users and either filter the content they see or exclude them from any content that could be deemed harmful under the law. That is a quote from EFF. And I would say it is definitely worth considering if you want every app, website, or online atmosphere you interact with, because this is going to apply, I believe, to anything that has a form of forum, some way for users to add content to the site. It's going to impact all of those. I believe it's also any business as well. for all of those sites to have your government ID or your credit card information in order to be able to verify your age, because people have been blowing this off as, oh my god, they're just going to lie about their age online. States like Florida and so many other states have been seeking immense legal action for the books in libraries. There have been so many pictures coming out of those states in which libraries are empty now because they can't afford to go to jail because they don't know what books have content that is going to be deemed illegal, and they will be persecuted in the event that they get something wrong. Gonna come back to something like that later. So a lot of sites, in order to avoid actual legal conflict from people that are going to push and that are going to seek damages and going to seek consequences like aggressively for stuff like this, people are going to need to do something more than just are you over 18 or not. And in order to actually effectively enforce that's going to mean having actual genuine important information about every single user so they know which ones are not actually a teen. And with that comes concerns about how we know major companies use our data, not to mention how many of them have rolled out forced arbitration, i.e. you can't sue them clauses in the event of a leak of your data. So many sites have been rolling out in new terms of services that you just click on and go along with, or that you don't even have to accept, that simply if you pass it by, if it shows up as a little block in your screen, then you agree to it at that point. Those are forced arbitrations. A lot of those have forced arbitration. You are no longer able to sue these companies. Back to EFF. EFF agrees that the government has a compelling interest in protecting children from being harmed online, but KOSA's broad requirement that platforms and services face liability for showing speech concerning particular topics to minors is not narrowly targeted to that interest. As said above, the broad censorship that will result will effectively limit access to a wide range of lawful speech on topics such as addiction, bullying, and eating disorders. The fact that KOSA will sweep up so much speech shows that it is far from the least speech restrictive alternative too. Okay, there is precedent in the form of two Supreme Court cases. There are two Supreme Court cases that are relevant to the conversation we're having right now. Bantam Books Inc. versus Silicon and Smith versus California, that ruled similar laws were unconstitutional because the ordinance tends to impose a severe limitation on the public's access to constitutionally protected material, because a distributor of other speech will react by limiting access to any borderline content that could get it into legal trouble. That's from the Smith case. In the Smith case, the issue is about preventing a bookstore from selling books that are deemed obscene, and they said even if the obscenity ordinance at issue in Smith had made an exception, letting bookstores sell scientific books with detailed pictures of human anatomy, the bookstore would still have to exhaustively review every book it sold and separate the obscene books from the scientific. The Supreme Court rejected such burdens as offensive to the First Amendment. It would altogether be unreasonable to demand so near an approach to omniscience. The near impossible standard required to review such a large volume of content, coupled with liability for letting any harmful content through, is precisely the scenario that the Supreme Court feared. The bookseller's self-censorship, compelled by the state, would be a censorship affecting the whole public, hardly less virulent for being privately administered. The court wrote in Smith, through it, the distribution of all books, both obscene and not obscene, would be impeded. And these are consequences that we've already seen. Filtering content, which has been seen by Facebook's implementation of a child mode, is going to result in minors not having access to mass amounts of legal information that could and likely would be beneficial and helpful for these topics. Quote, Meta currently places teens into the most restrictive content control settings on Instagram and Facebook. The company specifically updated these settings for many of the categories included in KOSA, including suicide, self-harm, and eating disorder content. Their update describes precisely what we worry about. KOSA would require, by law, The categories included in KOSA. No. Their update describes precisely what we worry KOSA would require by law. While we allow people to share content discussing their own struggles with suicide, self-harm, and eating disorders, our policy is to not recommend this content, and we have been focused on making it harder to find. And what's extremely dangerous about this, and what I don't know if people realize this, is that a lot of people figure out they have a problem this way. I didn't realize that my custody holder, when I was a child, I didn't realize my custody holder was abusive until one day before my senior year of high school. I watched something on the topic, and it was outright said, oh, it's not normal for a child to be scared anytime their parent was home. But because that's not something you talk about with people, and like, you don't talk about that with your friends. You don't talk about that with your babies, or you don't talk about that with, like, people just don't talk about that on the day to day. And so I literally did not know that it was not normal to be scared of your parent anytime they were just in the vicinity, and to be deeply terrified of your parent. But I found that information in other scenarios in which they were discussing these types of things, and that's how I knew I was not in a safe space, and it wasn't absurd for me to be scared of the situation I was in. A major concern for the bill had been that the state attorney would be the one enforcing KOSA's duty of care, and with how bigoted legal action has spread like wildfire, book banning being gay in public being illegal in Florida, etc., the chance for abuse was high. They're no longer in charge of specifically the duty of care, but, quote, KOSA will still let state attorney general enforce other provisions, including a section requiring certain safeguards for minors. Among the safeguards is a requirement that platforms limit design features that lead to minors spending more time on a service, including the ability to scroll through content, be notified of other content or messages, or autoplay content. The Attorney General would simply target the same content or service it disfavored, but instead of claiming that it violated KOSA's duty of care, the official instead would argue that the service failed to prevent harmful design features that minors in their state use, such as notifications or endless scrolling. We think the outcome will be the same. States are likely to use KOSA to target speech about sexual health, abortion, queer rights, and a variety of other information. And again, we've seen this in Florida, where they are saying, oh, kids are learning about critical race theory, and they just mean anything having to do with a person of color at all, period. Like, that no one's stopping them. And it's like we've seen flimsy and inaccurate reasoning to hold someone liable for speech around the US, and for them to still allow that in this and allow attorney generals state by state to have that power is something that does not feel like it's being acknowledged what's actually been happening, and how these types of tools have been practically used across the country. I personally think that overregulation of spaces is not the solution we need to ensure safer spaces for children. I think that a major part of the real issue we have here is that people are taking, like, the concept of it takes a village and applying it globally, but a key part of the village is the nearness, the close relationships. Random strangers that don't know your kid exist can't protect them the same way that they can't protect you if they don't know you exist. They don't know who you are. They don't know what you need. Kids need safety nets of close, trusted adults. They need environments that ensure they have adult guidance at every stage of their growth. But because of the suffocating economy we live in, oftentimes parents barely get to be a part of those moments themselves, let alone other people in the area. And instead of pulling society in a direction that allows adults to be more present with the children around them, we attempt to put bubble wrap around the rest of the world without fully understanding what that is realistically going to do to the child. That is basically just my way of saying universal basic income would do far more to protect children than this, and we've explicitly seen that happen. We saw that happen in 2020 when when we had people getting reliable income from the government to cover because of a lot of the layoffs and furloughs. And we saw child abuse explicitly go down. And because there was likely also a better means of interacting, better means of talking with your child, of being able to be present with them as they are like growing, developing, rather than the like kind of idea of like hand them a tablet and let them be off because you have things to do. What if you didn't have as much to do? What if you could actually prioritize being with the child and fully helping them develop? What if I don't know. But that is all I have to say on this topic. Thank you so much for watching. If you want to support me in any way, I sell books. I've got the Queen of Thieves series. This is my spy series about a girl who goes to work for the government that ruined her life. And then we've got my new adult romance, this fake cover. We'll see if I ever get around to getting a real cover of the book. But this is Imani and Aaliyah's fashion Bible. It is the autistic cheerleader romance. It's very fun, cute, and emotional time. Both books are linked down below. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, valedictions, friends.